Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I want to begin by jumping back a little bit to a theme that was developed in the book earlier, but he comes back to it briefly in the assignment for today. It's the whole notion of the ego, okay, of one's self-centeredness. And there are a number of modern statements on that I found in a compilation of Hasidic and mystical interpretations called the Iturei Torah, which I've had for years. The Iturei Torah, this is an interesting piece of information for you. Iturei Torah, I don't think there's an English translation of it, but it was compiled by a man named Aharon Yaakov Greenberg. Aharon Yaakov Greenberg, not Rabbi Aharon Yaakov, because he wasn't a rabbi, but he was a Yodea Sefer. He knew books. I mean, he was a very type of a Renaissance guy. His primary calling in life was politics. He was a Chaver Knesset from the Mafdal party, the national religious party. And he was the number 2 guy, the vice chair of the Knesset in certain points in time. So, working with a coalition. So the guy was a politician, but he published this magnificent compilation of Hasidic and mystical learning. And I used to use it for sermons all the time. I mean, I think Rabbi Klickfeld does also. It's wonderful. Anyway, so this is part of it that deals with the line where Jacob wakes up from his dream of the ladder or staircase going from earth to heaven, and he says, "Achein." This is it's Exodus. Genesis chapter 28, verse 16. Genesis 28:16. Achein yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh va'anochi lo yadati. Indeed, verily, God is in this place, and I did not know. Okay, and the key word here is anochi. Okay, I. All right. So one of the commentators that he has, Tiferet Shlomo, if indeed there is in this place a flowing down of the divine presence, im hishreiti et kedusha b'makom hazeh, and if I absorb this holiness in this place, hareze biglal, this is because I was able to do this, says Jacob. Va'anochi lo yadati, I did not know my anochi, meaning anochi means I. Shebitalti et hayesh shebi, I negated the beingness of me. I negated my ani, myself. I negated myself, right? And I did not know any of my egotism. My egotism disappeared. That means anochi lo yadati. What was it that I didn't know? I couldn't know my anochiyut, my egotistical essence, because it wasn't there, right? And it was the any kind of self-focused intent was gone, right? And that's how he could realize and absorb the holiness that was revealed at that time. And why? And all of this was for the sake of God, U'L'shem yichud kedusha brichu shchinte. For the sake of the unification of God and His Shekhinah. That's a mystical ending. The point being that when human beings can negate their selfishness and open their souls totally to God, okay, then you are taking a step to completing the unification of God and Shekhinah, which is out of whack 6 out of the 7 days of the week because of the sinfulness of the people. So you do a mitzvah, but that's if you want to connect with God. Nobody can do the ultimate connection, but if you want to connect with the lower emanation of God, you've got to negate your selfishness. Okay, and it's a basic principle in Kabbalah. The Hebrew word ani, aleph, nun, yud, right, is reformulated into aleph, yud, nun, ayin, which means nothing. So you take your ani and you shift it around into nothingness. You negate your ego. Okay, and it takes effort. But on the other hand, if you do that, then you can begin to move toward a connection with ayin. Okay, you become ayin. You become nothing. Aleph Yud Nun. You become nothing. But then you can connect with Ein. Ein Sof. That's God. So those 3 letters, Aleph Nun Yud, Aleph Yud Nun, are played around with in order to create this whole mystical concept of connectedness with God, as incomplete as it might be. Fascinating. Okay? So that's what Jacob did. But keep in mind here, the concept being that your ego gets in the way of your relationship with God, not only with people, but also with God. Okay, and so he goes on now in the collection. The collector says, "Beoto signon mefarash mefaresh Rabbi Dover, the Maggid of Mezrich, the great Hasidic master, that a pasuk v'anochi yomed ben Adonai v'nechem." Okay, so Moses says this is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 5, when he talks about the beginning of the giving of the 10 Commandments. Okay, he says, Anochi, Omeid, Moses says, I am standing, there's that word again, Anochi, I am standing between you and God. What does he learn? Ha'anochiyut, egotism, hu ha'masach ha'mavdil v'ha'mafsik ben ha'adam levein kono. That is the curtain that separates between the human being and his creator. Your ego has got to be held in check. That's one of the points that our author, that Held, has been mentioning. Your ego has to be held in check. And there's one final one which I really love. Okay? So he says a certain lamdan, a learned person, right, who gloats over the fact that listen to this, he gloats over how spiritual he is. So he once came before Rabbi Elimelech, okay, and he's asked him, and with this question, it's a charge, he says, I can't get this. Something's wrong here. Okay, he says, for 30 years, I have been learning Torah for its own sake. It's a mitzvah. Learn Torah for its own sake, and for no ulterior motive. Okay, that's one view of it. All right, how so? Beseter, in secret. In other words, by myself. By myself. For 30 years, I've been by myself studying Torah. That's all I do. Okay? Why is it that I can't hook up with the Ruach HaKodesh, with the Holy Spirit, with God? So the Rebbe says, oh, this is explicitly stated in the Bible. All right. Im yisater ish b'mistarim. If a person hides himself in a secret place, right? If he stays by himself, locked away in his room, just doing Torah and prayer for 30 years, and it says ani, and he modifies this a line from Jeremiah, and he redivides the word, and he says it's ani. It becomes an ani. If you lock yourself away, you are becoming an ani. And what is ani? It means I'm now quoting here, upitem et ha'anuchiyot shalo, and he fattened up his egotism. By doing that, you become a fat egotist, right? And then, what does God say? Lo erenu ne'umanai. God says, I can't see him. Why? Because his fat egotism is blocking the way for the connection between a person and God. Okay, that's what I wanted to share, just to show you that the tradition is fully aware of the problem of the human ego. And I just think it's so correct, so correct. All right, so there you go. Marion Klein has a comment.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was really, I loved it. I love it. And it reminds me that, when we do the Shema, when we do anything, and we're talking about oneness, oneness is that, if I may use the word vessel, we become a vessel for God and for the transmission of love and for all of that. And that is that's the Shema. That's what we're here for.
Right.
And that is, that oneness, the connection is a word. There are lots of words to use for the oneness, and really it's all one. And it really is, it's a beautiful, thank you for bringing that in.
You're welcome. That was the whole point, right? The guy a person, it's a real critique of people who study in the yeshiva all day and do nothing with it. Now, if you go out and teach it, that's different, right?
Well, they had Havcharuta, and they had other people that they were around. They weren't totally by themselves, but you're saying that this also applies.
No, but I mean, the point is,
if
they study, but then it's the egos feeding off of each other, so to speak. The point is, you've got to go outside beyond studying and act on it, either by teaching people who are not part of that locked-in study, right? I would say a yeshiva where people just study with each other all the time and don't do anything with it.
But aren't they having to be that way with their colleagues and people that are also studying with them? In other words,
well, no.
I get it. Going out is definitely
if they open the doors and allow people to come in and study with them, yes, then they're teaching. Teaching counts as spreading, as going out of your locked place, right? But if you stay only in your locked place, but even more than that, it's also doing other forms of masim, of action, right? Sharing Torah is important, but it is only one form of actually we're going to study later on. The material I gave you, we'll look at in a minute or two, deals with imitation of God. And what are all of those things? Doing things for other people, for humankind, when they are needed. Action, right? You cannot just fill yourself with the theory. You've got to do that, yeah. But you then have to apply the theory in real life if you want to change the world. Okay? And that's part of what human beings are supposed to do, right? We are partners with God in completing the creation of the world. That's what the Talmud, that's what our sages teach us. Can't do it unless you get out there and do something constructive. Okay, Tybal.
When you were talking about that, my mind did not go to men studying yeshiva. My mind actually went to the historical phenomenon of anchorites. The Roman Catholic penitents who literally had themselves walled up and didn't really act with other human beings for the rest of their lives. And it made me think about just differences in worldview, because anchorites were seen as the most modest, the most penitent, whatever, in terms of withdrawing. And actually, I don't think there are modern day anchorites. I don't really know. But human affairs, maybe there are a few out there. But I started thinking, wouldn't it be interesting, given what brain scans can do, if difference in human choices and evaluation could look and see how much a brain scan is focused on oneself versus other things. Anyway, that's what made me think of. But if you have any historical comments on anchorites, I'd be interested.
No, I don't. But I mean, look, there are many, monastic movements in Christianity have flourished throughout history. There were monastic movements that opened their doors and shared their wisdom and shared their deeds, goodness in the world. There are other ones who just were locked up and totally self-focused. So it depends. I know now in many places in the Catholic world, the monasteries are open all the time. People can come in, they have meditation, they have classes, and they engage, which is fine. That's wonderful. But there are others. I mean, I'm not up to date on all that stuff. Yeah, but clearly, it's a major problem for people who get engaged in the spiritual and don't realize that it is very selfish. Unfortunately, yep. Okay, now I'm going to stop. This is my introduction for the day. I want to get your reaction to some of the ideas that you read in the 3 chapters that we studied. And then I'm going to share with you, I want to read with you the source material that I sent you, most of which, as you saw, comes from the sources. And there are a few one final quotation there from Held, which I found to be very, very nice. All right, so any observations, comments that you had thought about over the course of reading the material? Bobby.
I think I was most struck by the idea that when the temple was destroyed and we gave up sacrifices, the substitute for sacrifices was acts of loving kindness. I always thought it was tefillah.
It's both.
But he didn't really mention it. He made it seem like it was acts of loving kindness. He didn't even mention tefillah.
That point here. Yes. Yeah. Because that fits in with his hypothesis. I guarantee you, he knows the other thing as well. There's no question about that.
That's why I was surprised, because that was different than what I had heard previously.
Yeah, no, but he read. Remember, he's writing the book emphasizing certain things. It's not his intent. I'm not trying to defend him, but he's a conservative rabbi. He understands fully that prayer came into existence after the temple was destroyed. He knows the statements, that the Shachari,
that was the thing I found surprising, because he made it pretty dogmatic.
Right. I hear you. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good point. I agree in the sense it would have been nice if at least he would have had a footnote where he would have referred to the fact that prayer, right, replaced. And by the way, that's a big deal, because if you think about it, it says, think about the Passover Haggadah, right? The last part of it before you finish has the words of Rabbi Gamliel, and he says, you have to say these words regarding Pesach matzah and maror, right? The Paschal lamb, eating of matzah, and the bitter herbs, in order to fulfill your religious obligation. And those three things represent the essence of the Paschal sacrifice. And so effectively what Rav Gamliel is saying, by saying these words, you are effectively filling the gap filled by the absence of the temple and your ability to offer the Pesach sacrifice.
Well, all I can say is, for someone who shows up in shul as infrequently as I do for tefillah, it made me feel pretty good.
Yeah, I understand, but you. So are you?
I try to perform some acts of love and kindness. So
that's good too. Yes,
much more than I do tefillah.
Well, then maybe you should make a balance.
That's right.
Yes. Okay, come, we can talk. I'll talk you into it. Okay. But
when services become the length of Muslim services, then you got me.
I see. Well, you can do whatever a lot of people do. Just come in for an hour.
I know.
I mean,
Muslim services are 10 minutes. The 5 times a day are 10 minutes.
I know. So, but it's Jews. You got to give at least an hour. Come on. All right. Okay. Kathy. Wait, no. Tybal, Kathy, and Bert.
What struck me most, and I even pulled the Hebrew text out and put them in a document to compare, is how he started with Deuteronomy chapter 10, 12, what God requires from people.
Yeah.
Which my father, may his memory be for a blessing, my whole life, anytime he could quote Micah 6.8, he quoted it to the point where we put it on his tombstone. Mm-hmm. So I always think of the Micah 6.8, which Rabbi Held didn't mention till much later in the chapter and didn't go into the same detail. So as I'm just saying, what struck me most was to look at those two pieces of text and try to figure out the differences.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I don't know. I understand what you're saying. Yes. The advantage of using Deuteronomy, of course, is that it's the 5 books of Moses, which establishes law. Right. Prophets don't necessarily establish law. So by drawing it out of that kind of a framework, it may have been, that may be, I don't know. I can't answer the why, but yes, that's a good point. All right, Kathy.
I think the point that I got from this was that whether you are religious or not religious, the doing of actions, the doing of charity or supporting, visiting the people in the hospital or in their home, going and volunteering to read to kids or whatever, that is a religious act. Yeah. And that those who say that you're not Jewish or you're not religious because you don't go to shul, I think he's pointing out that if you know Judaism and you know these laws and beliefs, that you are showing your Judaism.
I mean, he's half right. I can't argue. I can't say that he would tell people don't come to shul. Right? I think it's a matter of emphasis again. Remember, he's trying to push back against Christianity. Right? And so he's trying to show that Judaism is action-based. I mean, at the beginning of the book, remember, at the beginning of the book, he said, we are a faith tradition. We are a worshiping tradition, right? And he didn't deny it. He laid it out early on. There's a balance there. And then, but having said that, of course, he wants to say, but I'm going to emphasize the action part, because you got to understand our view of the world is that it's by sanctifying life and action that we believe that we are doing the will of God. Okay, and so and look at the very end. Well, we'll get there at the end. The last statement in waiting for God. I found the last two chapters in this reading, the short ones, they're very, very, very powerful statements. Challenging, but nonetheless very powerful statements and well written, I thought. But I think we have to keep in mind what one of his main goals with the book was. And that has been, the fact is, if you read, what Christian theologians of the past, and I'm sure it still exists in certain areas today, but I can speak for antiquity in the Middle Ages, that the whole notion that the Bible deals with the worldliness, it's a worldly book. It doesn't deal with the spiritual, right? That's the point that it makes over and over again. It deals with the worldly. Read the commandments in the Torah, right? And so and Paul is the one really who started this ball rolling. He says, that's for me. I'm stuck in this rut of this covenant because I'm a Jew. You guys out there, you're not. You believe in Jesus and you got the path. And there were even debates within the church as to whether or not doing good deeds it really count as much. There are theologies within basic old church thinking that make the point. Yeah, okay, pragmatically speaking, but ultimately the ultimate step in relationship with God is through belief in Jesus. He is the path. He is the path. And of course, what he's trying to show here is that no, in Judaism, there are multiple paths, and they all come together. And a Jew should view himself or herself as engaged in all of these paths. But you cannot complete the relationship with God unless all of these paths are part of your self-definition of how you run your life. Okay, I think that's what he's really trying to get across. But I understand, Kathy, what you said. In a sense that you get that feeling. Yes.
He does keep Torah.
Wait.
I'm sorry.
Kathy, go ahead.
He does keep Torah as one of the requirements.
Yes, of course.
And doing things. So that's sort of.
Right, exactly. But the emphasis is on actions, and that's fine. Remember, the Torah governs action a lot. That's the whole point. Torah is action-oriented completely. Not a lot of theology there. There is theology. But, once you establish the principle that there's one God, right? And remember, and the rabbis pick up on this. And as you talk about Deuteronomy, you remember, the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, everybody looks at that. But what is the second paragraph of the Shema in the liturgy, V'hayim Shemoah, that brings it right down to earth, right? If you follow the law, your life here on earth is going to be great. If you don't follow the law, you're in trouble down here, right? So the idea of carrying the faith into action, love of God must also have with it actions that are filled with love of God and love of humans and love of creatures. That's the point he's trying to make. Bert.
First, two quick comments on what's been said so far. In a way, Torah is the means, not the end. It is the means to living a godly life and a God-centered life. Mm-hmm. And if Torah just becomes the end, you were talking about someone locking himself in a room and just studying Torah all day. That's not really Torah.
Right.
The other comment, just with respect to what Bobby said, as someone who does daven and finds great inspiration from it, if the words don't mean anything, going to shul is not going to help you. Going to shul is not, so it really starts with trying to understand the words and what these prayers are all about. Just going in here, as Rabbi Artson once said, being in a room where everybody's making the same sounds at the same time doesn't get you anywhere. As far as what Rabbi Held said, one of the things that I believe this, but it really reinforced when he talked about children. And he talked about, what do we want from our children? What kind of children do we want to raise?
Yeah.
And his answer was, we want to raise good human beings. Okay, we want to raise people who live lives of chesed. And not necessarily, whether they're great lawyers or whether they're, make $1 gazillion or any of that. But who are they as people? And I found that powerful, although not surprising.
Right. But we see from what we've read, that the chesed is intended to be an imitation of God. In other words, it's not, there are Jews and even, I would say, rabbis and movements within the tradition that became so focused on the acts of loving kindness that they forgot the source of that concept and the whole notion that we have to be in touch with that source even as we do this. And you cannot simply say because it's the good thing to do. Ultimately, a Jew is supposed to say, this is a good thing to do, and it is what my God demands of me. And that's the whole issue, when you can debate what is halakha all about. All right? And the whole point is you're supposed to have a sense that when I'm doing acts of loving kindness, I'm doing this because this is part of my connectedness with a higher power, with God. And it's expressed through the religious aspects of my tradition. I mean, prayer, this is something we all need to keep in mind. I would say synagogue prayer is not only moments of creating personal connectedness with God, it's also connectedness with your community, but it's also an understanding that the way you act outside of shul is supposed to be a carryover of the principles that you read it and you pray about in shul. And there's a connection between the two.
My mother of blessed memory, who was a completely secular person, she would say to me, isn't it enough to be a good person? And the answer is yes and no. The real question is, how do you become a good person? What is a good person? Right. And how do you become a good person? Right. But you can't figure it out. I had that argument with my granddaughter about a month ago. How do you know what's good? And how do you find the daily connection and inspiration, which is what you're talking about, to do that?
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yes. All right, Barbara.
I actually disagree with Bert. I don't understand everything that I say. I am working at it because I am studying Hebrew, but just being in shul where everybody else is even davening around me and they're davening for me, they're instilling the ideas in me just by my being there more than I would get it if I'm away from the shul. Makes a big difference in my Jewish thoughts. I think being in the shul during davening is important. At least it is to me. Yeah. You can go ahead.
Yeah, but to respond, you began by saying you don't understand everything, but you do understand some of the things. And that's really where it begins. And I do agree with you, the experience of davening with people, particularly, that's why I love the library minyan, particularly people for whom this is really meaningful and are not going through the motions. So I didn't mean to say it has no value.
Right.
Okay, because that's the way it came off like, what's the point of being there if you don't understand it? And a large number of people that don't understand. Go ahead, Joel.
Right. No, I just want to say in Bert's defense, he's in shul every Shabbos.
Well, so I was until I started having leg problems.
All right, that Barbara, that's okay. You've spent plenty of hours in shul. You come when you can, and that's great. But Bert can say whatever he wants because actions speak louder than words. He's there all the time.
He can, but I just think that there's another side to it.
No, you're right.
I wanted to point out.
I agree. There's times for private spiritual meditation, but there's also the need to have a sense that you have a community that in one way or another affirms what you believe.
There's a big difference between saying the Shema when you're...
One second. We are strengthened. We are strengthened by that kind of an experience in terms of affirmation of who we are. And the fact is, human beings operate in relationship with other human beings. We are not monks or nuns. We are people who are part of our interaction with others is a critical part of how we run our life. And we need it. I mean, in that point, Aristotle was right. The human being is a social animal. We live in a herd. We don't live, a cheetah is a very strange animal. They live by themselves. They are monks. Okay. They're less than that. They are, the guys who used to go up in the mountains and live in a cave by themselves. I can't remember the word right.
Hermits? Do you mean hermit? Hermit?
What? Yeah, hermit. Right. Yeah. Cheetah is a hermit, in a sense. Right? Where lions are like us. They work in groups. Right? They're a community. And by the way, animals, most of them, well, I don't say most, lots of animals live in communities. And they operate, and that's their strength. And I think humans are similar in that regard. Okay. But we are humans. That's all. Don't forget it. We are human beings. That's fine. Okay, Denise. Wait, Denise.
So I feel like this dichotomy sort of way of looking at it of like, prayer and spirituality versus action. I feel like really, even though people might not be consciously thinking about it, that their spiritual part really underscores those actions and kind of informs them. So like my mom, for example, she always called herself non-religious. And at some point it was like, no, actually she was very religious in terms of how she thought. And she was very ethical and very kind, but she was not worshipful. She was not, she just didn't feel it from those actions. She wasn't raised with it. It didn't, very, very late in life she did, but for most of her life, it just didn't connect to her. But I remember one time we had this, it was like sort of an ongoing debate for like 20 years, but it sort of crystallized in this one conversation where she said, my father taught me if I can look at myself in the mirror and feel good, then I'm good, and it was like, yeah, that totally works because he was raised with a very strong foundation. But what if you're Charles Manson and you're looking in the mirror and you feel okay? That doesn't hold up so much, And so like you need that kind of objective quality control. And I also feel like, sort of out there in the world, I'm not aware of anything that connects to self-improvement. And I don't mean like, fitness and vitamins. I mean like kind of musser, like character development stuff. I'm not aware of anything like that that's ever come from a secular space. It doesn't only come from Judaism. Like Buddhism is very into that, and Christianity in some spaces is very into that, but I'm not aware of any secular inspired movement that leads people to be better and to work on themselves and to have the humility that says, I need work in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think that's valuable.
Yeah. No, I can't answer that one. I'd have to talk to my friend Elliot Dorff, who knows about comparative ethics. Okay. And, I have his books. I have other people's books as well. But I just can't respond about that, I would say just one thing though. I think that it is important that those of us who do ma'asim tovim, gemilut chesed, where we act ethically, help people in need and so forth and so on, we still should be in touch with the great being that is the foundation of the whole thing. Otherwise, we become secular and we lose touch with the the spiritual. And I think we need that because ultimately, how can we be held responsible for global warming if it's just a matter of self-preservation? If we, and one can argue, well, maybe yes, maybe no. But if you are a true believer, you say, no, it's not just self-preservation. This is the will of God. That's what chapter 1 of Genesis is all about. The world was created with natural law that operates. That's how it's supposed to run. And if we violate natural law, it's going to bounce back and really hit us hard. That relates to our well-being. But we would protect ourselves better of avoiding those kinds of pushbacks. Not everything, but we now know that we can manage things better if we, with nature, with the world that we understand God created in some mysterious way that we cannot understand. The point is, then we're in touch with God and we realize we have to become a part, we have to recognize we are only a part of a larger universal whole. And that you can't talk in those terms unless you say it's all an accident, then we're accidents. Right? If there is no God, we're accidents. It happened. So how sacred can I be if I'm an accident? Right? I can kill 6 million Jews. They're only accidents. And I have more strength than they do, so get them the hell out of here. Right? That's what it boils down to. But if I am part of a giant universe that has an order to it and a value to it because it ultimately is the result of a divine creation, then it changes my perspective on all this. It should reinforce us for being a good human being. We're going back to what Held talked about at the beginning, the image of God. Right? If I see another human being as the image of God, I got to be very careful about how I deal with that human being. It's when I strip the human being of any kind of higher meaning that they become like an animal. How's a human being different from a cow? Except that, well, I'm a human being, you're a human being. So in a sense, our self-preservation instincts operate. But at the same time, ultimately, but that's the point. Cows, I'm not going to worship a cow, but I believe that a cow is part of this major universe of which we are parts. And I got to treat it with respect. So we have the principle, Tsar Balei Chayim. We're not supposed to inflict pain on animals because they're creatures. And we're supposed to care for the creatures. Okay? All right. Let's see. All right. Margaret, and then Marion wants to come back. Okay. I want to get to my reader here. So, all right, go ahead. Margaret.
I just want to try to say this as quickly as I can, because anyway, at the beginning you were talking about the idea of ego and trying to dispense with or move beyond, right? Transcend ego, fair to say?
Control.
Okay. And I think that, some of what we're talking about in terms of like, the idea that, for example, if you go to shul and you are maybe doing things by rote, I can see why that would be unsatisfactory for a lot of people, and I can see why it would be unsatisfactory for a lot of people. But I think that there's actually a powerful function of rote recitation, and I think that it actually helps in the cultivation of it helps to shed ego, or it helps to control ego. You don't have to always have an intellectual relationship with the content, right? I mean, as Barbara was kind of alluding to, part of it is just being in the room with the same people, with everybody who's the same thing. But I think the words themselves, even just kind of meditative impact. And so I just think that there are these different, you can have different experiences, right, with prayer. And I think that experience is very valuable.
Right. No, I would agree. I mean, in other words, I tend to be more intellectually oriented, but at the same time, I can tell you when I'm davening in shul and I close my eyes and I just let myself be carried away by the sense of being part of this prayerful community, that has a very powerful impact on me in terms of my spiritual self. I get the sense, wow, I'm doing something very important. All these other people are agreeing with me because we're singing the same melody and we're trying to elevate ourselves in some fashion. When I close I know a lot of the prayers by heart, and yes, I'm running through them, but at the same time, from point to point, because I understand them, I can pause on a given point and say I have a little spark of insight that I just gained from these few words in this prayer. And that makes it even more meaningful for me because it elevates my understanding of the principles that are behind it. I believe prayer, I'm not saying, look, prayer has a multifaceted purpose, right? 1 is contact with God, 2 is contact with community, 3 is contact with yourself, and 4 is contact with the many basic ideas that are the foundation of this whole thing. But you can operate at any given moment in time if you're within a group at that level. Sometimes you want to lock yourselves into your own little cocoon within the community and say, I'm going to focus on. I've told people, I think I've told you this, if you can't say the whole Amida, look at a paragraph. Meditate on that paragraph. You got commentaries now, and look at your commentaries. Think about it. And if you get stuck on one concept, God will be very happy. Okay, so you're right, I would say, Margaret. There are many levels, and each individual, it could even change. The same person today is looking for X. Tomorrow they're looking at Y. The next day they'll be looking at Z. Fine, but you're there. That's the key thing. Oy vey, Smith, this is such a topic. I want to read. All right. I'm going to take 3 more comments, but before I do, Jacqueline Bassan, are you related to the Bassan family, Mayor Bassan, Jonathan Bassan?
Yes, but I haven't met them. That's through my ex-husband's family. Yeah.
Okay.
I've heard of them. Meyer in Israel. Is that what you mean, Meyer?
Who?
Do you mean Meyer Bassan, the doctor in Israel? Because that's yes. And how do I know that? My father-in-law told me about it.
Okay. Thank you.
And I was in Israel when I was 17, worked on a kibbutz and loved it. And I love Israel. And I think Judaism is, it's just so up there. I feel, like Wayne's World, the movie, We Are Not Worthy. That's me. I'm just, I was a member of Adat Ariel for 20 years. Since the pandemic, nothing in person, all on my own. And now I'm kind of slowly getting back into at least the Zooms. That's where I am right now.
Excellent. Very good. All right. So I'm going to take Marion, Barbara, and Bobby, and then we're going to look at the material. Otherwise, I'll have you read it next week. Okay.
So 2 threads. I'll try and go quickly. I mentioned Ethical Culture Society, and I got a little bit of both my parents were ethical culture people, and that was their community, and they were in it since they were 5. So actually, they had the same teacher, and they never met then, but they re-met in college, and that was in common, and they fell in love. So anyway, I felt like, who was it who said, my father was one of the most spiritual people I ever knew, and he was an atheist. So I feel like that he was definitely all about humility, improvement, and the group as well. But it was about individual in the group. I don't think there was one over the other. That's just to go into that thread, but that's just having grown up that way. And I think that's where I got a lot of my Yiddish. I got my Yiddishkeit from my mother, but in terms of that other kind of peace I really got from my father. And anyway, but that's just a real quick on that. You asked me to say more. I really feel like it came both ways. The other thing is I actually have a question about some of this. And now you know my background also. I have my mother was the one who told me that there was spirituality in Judaism as an adult, because I, only knew the synagogues down the street, and I only knew that. And of course that wasn't me. I didn't belong. So I always thought of it as a practice and as a group of people. And I grew up in a time when, when the bat mitzvahs and the bar mitzvahs were, everybody was throwing all their money into it. They still do that today, but it just felt like it just didn't feel real to me. And maybe that was me justifying where I was, who knows? But the point is, I really did not get that Judaism had a spiritual side until I was much older. And it was my mother, the atheist, who told me about it. And she's the one who steered me on this path because she knew I was into spirituality. Now, what I'm asking is, I don't understand, or can you explain how? Basically, it's a bypass. You're the first rabbi like this that I've heard talk about it so much, and it's not totally true. There was another one at Beth Am. That's one of the reasons I'm attracted to Beth Am, by the way. Is that there is spirituality spoken about. It's not this other language. But I'm really curious about that whole thing, where it got sort of divorced and almost got to be a dirty word on some levels anyway.
I can give you a short answer. I think what happened in the conservative movement, and I can only speak for that, the thinking of Mordechai Kaplan became very influential on young rabbis who came out of the seminary in the 50s. The whole notion of being able to serve the community, community values and stuff like that. And to be very honest, God bless my Rabbi Jacob Pressman, but I didn't, in growing up, discussion, words of trying to comprehend God that came. And I was in shul every Shabbos with my father, and then, later on, whatever. Didn't talk about it that much. I mean, values, absolutely. Absolutely. Values as they related to human beings, yes, no question. That was part of Kaplan's Torah. But there were a lot of younger people who became rabbis during that period who were leaving orthodoxy, and they sort of, which they thought was this rigid, antiquated approach to Judaism, right? And to some ways it was, and it also had become sort of stultified. Okay, now you had, the Hasidic elements and so forth, but their presence was very small at that time. They grew over time. But the point is, and these people were intellectually oriented, they all had college degrees and so forth. So when Kaplan came out with this notion and made a big deal about it, a lot of these people who had been raised in the Orthodox community looking for some fresh air jumped over there. All right. And they were observant and all that stuff. But in terms of dealing with questions of God, I'm trying to get a handle on how to comprehend God, wasn't part of the curriculum, if you will, that much. And I swore to myself, when I get on the bima, I'm going to bring God back to the bima. And that's what I did. I'm not a great theologian. I admit it. But I am a thinker, and I'm a believer, and I have my understanding of how God operates. I told you, I'm a sacred agnostic. I believe in God, but I cannot tell you exactly what God is, because it's beyond me. Remember, and I follow the footsteps of Maimonides and the Zohar in that statement. Ultimately, my pea brain cannot comprehend God. And by the way, it's very interesting, just as a side point here. I read one of oh my God, what's his names? Wait 3 hours, I'll get back to you. The poor guy, he was a total cripple, one of the most genius astrophysicists.
Hawking.
Oh, you don't mean Hawking, who had an affair with when he was in a wheelchair with
Stephen Hawking.
Hawking, talking about values.
Stephen Hawking. Yeah, hold on. I read his critique of God. Okay, you know who he's criticizing? The God of the Bible. Okay, that doesn't convey my personal understanding of God. Okay, and the rabbis talk about God in all kinds of different ways. I understand that was their way of expressing their faith. I have a way that's different. I learn from them. I understand the way I would love to understand God working, but that I don't. Then if you want me to say, do you believe in the God of Genesis who spoke and the world came into being, and there was actually an expression of words? No. Okay, I don't. Do I believe that God was the ultimate creator? Yes, I think God pushed the button on the Big Bang. Okay, whatever that means. Okay, that's my faith. In other words, there is this presence that exists that fits a lot of what Judaism says God does, but to express it in the sort of anthropomorphic way that the Bible does, I understand it, but I can contextualize it because I accept the teachings of history at different points in time. Different concepts of God arose. I think I told you, I gave a sermon. I found 16 different theologies within Jewish sources from the Bible down till today. Okay, and that was just off the top of my head. 16 different theologies. Okay, which is right. They're all right. Okay, but the point is, I believe. Okay, yes. All right. I'm sorry, Barbara. I can't take you again. Bobby Meth is the last question. Sorry. No, I said, what? I can't hear you, Barbara. Wait, Barbara, you're muted.
Bobby Meth already talked too. Why can't I?
Oh, no, I before you raised your hand, Barbara, please, I want to move on. Bobby.
I'll yield to Barbara.
Huh?
I'll yield to Barbara.
Both of you can talk if you make it brief.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that probably the most touching time or spiritual time that I had on the tour with the group with the synagogue last year, or early this year, was when we had spent an evening with the Muslims, and they prayed in front of us, and their prayer was not long. Bobby is right, but it was a different prayer than ours. And then we prayed in front of them. In their case, the Muslim imam led it. He was the only one that talked loudly and really talked. The others kind of mumbled a little bit in their prayers. And then we did it, and it was the opposite because our whole group knows all the songs and prayers, and we were loud and joyful and stuff. It was an interesting thing to see the difference. Actually, in our Ma'ariv just took 10 minutes also. So right, sure. There are prayers in Judaism that take only 10 minutes. And then Tyblin and I have had a couple of times, and she commented already in this, that when we had Zoom for our prayers on Shabbos, that it was more meaningful than seeing them on YouTube. Yeah, because you were involved. You were part of the group.
Of course, we understand. Yes. Thank you.
And then the last, very minor thing is that you asked about what we felt out of these chapters. And what I got out of it the most was probably the fact that we are all holy in the eyes of God. I thought, and that's what I wanted to say.
All right, Bobby.
I have 3 very quick points. I've long contended that religion is the only social institution I know of that exists specifically to make people less selfish. And then, along with what Rabbi Rembam said earlier, Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz worded it in the following way. He said, the most important thing that goes on in the synagogue is what goes on outside of the synagogue. And then to contrast what Bert said about understanding the language, of blessed memory, Rabbi Harold Kushner used to say he preferred to pray in Hebrew because it wasn't his first language. He didn't understand it as well as English. So he didn't understand the words. And that's what allowed him to have prayer be meaningful for him, because the words understanding them was what made it difficult for him.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a little bit, and it makes it something different. You can interpret it. You listen to the sounds. That's why, in some of you in my Psalms class, the sounds of the language are very important in understanding the meaning of the Hebrew. And if you can just listen to the sounds in some of the prayers, you'll hear sounds, not melodies, but sounds, consonants, verbs, whatever, repeat themselves. And it's poetry, and that means this is something significant. That's why the author did that, all right? And you can use that as just listen to that and say, that's an important thing. I got to look at the translation, something like that. All right. You have this material that I gave you. Grab it. I don't know what you did with it, if you printed it out. I know some of you who are not, Jacqueline, you didn't get it because you're not on my list right now. So when we finish, I'll give you, before we go, I'll give you the email. You send me your email and you can get these things if you want to stay in the class. All right. So, okay. So now, first of all, I want to go back and read quickly something that you do have. It's at the top, right? The Mishnah Avot, okay? Shimon HaTzadik Hayami She'arei Knesset HaGdolah. Simon the Righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. We're not sure exactly who this is. A lot of people think it may be. This is apparently a high priest named Shimon. The point is there were 4 Shimons who operated as high priests, one right after the other, in Jerusalem over the course of the 3rd century and into the 2nd century BCE. And most of the people think this is this number 2, who lived around 250 BCE. And what I wanted to make note of here is, according to this tradition, and he was one of the great men of the Great Assembly. In other words, he is one of the last of those people who, according to rabbinic tradition, gathered around Ezra and Nehemiah, and there were like their Sanhedrin, okay, their wise sages with whom they operated, and the rabbis saw that entity as the precursor to the rabbinic Sanhedrin that operated after the destruction of the temple, okay? And so that was their paradigm. They believed that, this is how we've operated. There was a Sanhedrin that exists before the temple was destroyed. We now have our rabbinic Sanhedrin, and that all is part of a tradition that began in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Then it proves what? That was at the time of the Bible. It was all under the guidance of divine revelation. Therefore, sages who gather around together, there's a precedent for it. So it's all in a sense of law and precedent as well. Okay. So here's what he says. Hu haya omer, he said, al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. The world stands upon 3 things. Al ha'Torah, Torah. Al ha'avodah. Avodah doesn't mean working here or slavery. It means the temple service. Okay, avodah is another term. One of its meanings is worship of God. Okay, prayer. All right. In this case, not prayer, sacrifice. Right, 3rd century BCE. Temple is operating. Okay, this was a priest, a high priest. But finally, the last one, the one we're talking about, the al gemilut chasadim, practice of acts of loving kindness. So already in the 3rd century BCE, you can see that a thinker within the within the leadership of the community was talking about the significance of loving kindness as a foundational principle. That's the point here. Equal in significance to Torah, the study and living of Torah, which is the broadest factor, yes. Then temple service, which is the worship of the sacrifices, which is the next narrowest. And finally, acts of loving kindness, which deals with how each individual runs their lives. You see what this is? Broad, less broad, singular. All right, and they are all of equal significance. These are the foundational principles. And there you have it, somebody in the 3rd century, a thinker, 3rd century BCE, is already pushing that as a foundational principle. Bobby.
This was precisely the source that Rabbi Shai Held used in his argument.
I know.
Why? I don't understand why he didn't just say that.
We talked about
the
it.
Filah.
We talked about it.
He could, instead of saying because one was gone, now it's up to the other 2 principles. I don't know why he didn't say that Avodah became Tefillah.
Yeah, I don't know. We talked about it before. I understand. Yes.
Because this was his source.
I know.
For his argument. It doesn't make sense.
Yes. No, but that's the way he decided to use it. Okay. All right. I go back to what I said before. I think because he wants to put an emphasis more on that element of religion to indicate that because that's how you express love. That's his point. Love of God, obviously, is one thing, but love of people is the point that Christians, he says, did not understand as operating within Jewish tradition. So he's pushing that. Bert?
He also cited an earlier source, which was Ki Chesed Chavatzti V'lo Zavach.
Yeah, well, we'll get
Hosea, which is, I think that predates the Mishnah.
Yeah, correct. Yes, it does. But that is God speaking. Okay, this is a sage speaking. That's why I want to make a difference.
What's the sage's name, please? Shimon
HaTzadik. Simon the Righteous. Yes. Yeah. Right, Shimon. This is Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, Chapter 1, Mishnah 2. It's right up at the beginning. All right, almost at the beginning. And that's yes. But I'm saying it's important that it comes from the voice other than the voice of God. This is now a human voice reflecting that. And placing it in the, prophets. There are many critiques of sacrifices. In the Bible itself, prophets did that because they saw corrupt priests, and they were. That's the problem with the priesthood is it's a human being. It's run by people, and you got good people and people not so good. Even in the priesthood, I hope any Kohanim here, anybody a Kohen, anybody want to be a Kohen? Okay.
No, I like being a woman, Rabbi.
I see. Good. Ha ha.
I'm scared of blood.
Okay. You can be a Kohenet. All right. So now let's move into the Talmud, okay? Now the material that you have here is taken from this is from Sephariah, and this is the Steinsaltz comment, the Steinsaltz translation, and it's literal, and woven in here is interpretation or explanation on the part of Steinsaltz as to make it flow, because the Talmud speaks in very short terms. In many instances, they're like code words, and unless you have the interpretation as it flows, it's hard to understand. So this works. So the problem is, and I tried and I couldn't do it. If you look at it on the Sephariah website, there's a difference between the original text, which is in bold, and the commentary, the interpretation, which is woven among the words of the original text, which is not bold. And you can differentiate. When I copied it and tried to get it here, it wouldn't take. Okay, so I couldn't do that. And I did not want to go through this thing word by word and have it, because I could have adjusted it, right? I could have said, okay, these 3 words are the original. I'm going to bold that, and now I'll make this italics. That would have taken me 5 hours, and I haven't had 5 hours to do it, so you'll excuse me. But it's understandable. That's the key thing. All right. Somebody please read. This is what Rabbi Elazar said. Rabbi Elazar was a rabbi around the time of Rabbi Akiva. I would say it's 2nd century Common Era. Okay, late 1st, 2nd century Common Era. Somebody read, please.
Okay, and this is what Rabbi Elazar said. What is the meaning of that which is written? It has been told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord does require of you. Only to do justly and to love mercy, chesed, and to walk humbly with your God, Micah 6:8.
Right.
To do justly, this is justice. To love mercy, this is acts of loving kindness. To walk humbly with your God, this is referring to taking the indigent dead out for burial and accompanying a poor bride to her wedding canopy, both of which must be performed without fanfare.
Right. In other words, doing something without seeking praise for doing it.
Yeah. This section was in the Old Sim Shalom.
Yes, it's found in, well, correct.
Okay.
The Shabbat version.
That one, right.
We call this Slim Shalom.
Right. Okay. Rabbi Elazar said, one who performs acts of charity is greater than one who sacrifices all types of offerings. As it is stated, to perform charity and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than an offering. Proverbs 21:3, including all types of offerings.
All right, so there you have it. Remember, all these guys lived after the temple was destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So there, and just to put it in historical context, Rabbi Elazar as an example, okay? That's the whole point, because what the sages of that period had to deal with was the trauma of the absence of sacrificial activity. Keep in mind, Solomon built the first temple in the 10th century BCE. All right, other than the time in Babylonian exile, which will be 50, 60 years until, let's say, the second temple was rebuilt because the Persians said, build a temple. And we did. Okay, very modest. And then Herod built his beautiful temple. Okay. So the point is, basically, and according to Torah, there was a temple in a tent before that, right? So which probably means that prior to the time of David's time, nobody built a temple yet. And so they had a tent that they would carry around. All right, and it's difficult to really get a sense of how that whole system operated back then because it's too far in the past. Okay, there's more information as comes forward. Anyhow, so let's say from about 950 BCE until 70 CE, the vast majority of that time was sacrifices. And then suddenly it's gone.
When was it gone? When?
70
CE.
Okay, yeah.
Never to be rebuilt. And the trauma afterwards, one of the major tasks that these rabbis had was to create a surrogate for all that worship. And so one of the surrogates was prayer, as Bobby reminds us, and correctly. Okay? But in addition, another way was how you act, right? And especially in the notion of loving kindness, if you think about the effects of trauma on human beings, this is a period when you have to be especially sensitive because people lost, and if you go beyond this, if you carry this down after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was about 130 CE, and the devastation there was even worse than the destruction of the temple. The population of Jews in Eretz Yisrael was hammered as a result of the Bar Kokhba revolt in a way that makes the revolt in 66-70 seem like a piece of cake. It was devastated. And where was the majority of the community living? In the Galilee. And Jerusalem, according to royal edict, imperial edict, was off limits. Jews could not live in Jerusalem. So what do? How do you worship God? How do you live a sacred life? So you pray, you study Torah, and you do acts of loving kindness. Okay? And you live within that framework. And so when you have statements like this, you got to keep in mind it's being said so that you could validate sacred acts that can help substitute for the loss of the sacrifices. Okay, it doesn't mean that teaching of, as you see already, that's why I brought this Shimon HaTzadik, who was a high priest, don't forget. All right, so the concept already existed within proto-rabbinic traditions in the 3rd century BCE, while the temple was still standing, that acts of loving kindness are very, very important. So it was there. But it became critical afterwards. And so you're going to see that, and that's why you have this is all found together in a section of the Talmud. All of these, and it's all Rabbi Elazar. He was one of the great leaders of the rabbinic community during this period. Okay, so Kathy, you had a question.
Yeah, so in the Torah, aren't there sections where God says, "Do I want sacrifices?" He does. There's really and I guess there's a statement kind of thing that God didn't want sacrifices.
That's prophets. The prophets.
Isaiah.
It's just prophets? Oh, okay.
No, there are a number who raise that question, and generally speaking, they're responding to what I said before, an inevitability that institutions at certain points in time become corrupt. And there were times when the priests were not doing their jobs. Okay? So, yeah, I mean, the Bible itself, I can't think of a place. No, the sacrifices are too central in the biblical traditions. They're part and parcel of the whole thing, along with everything else. Okay? So it's post-Torah that really comes into play. Not that it's a universal voice. I mean, the prophets, Isaiah had nothing against sacrifices. He's just saying if sacrifices are offered and you're living a life like this, that's generally what the prophets meant. I don't think any prophets say you don't tear down the temple, right? They don't, but they say you can't rely on that if everybody who's doing it gives sacrifices, and then it's like, the guy walks into shul and makes a donation on Yom Kippur of $10,000, and then turns around and cheats the person who's doing business with. Okay, that's sort of what they were talking about. That approach, like there's two different gods: the God who wants your sacrifices, and the God who looks the other way when you do bad things. Okay, and that brought about that prophetic response. Okay, so there you have it again. Now. Here, moving on. Somebody else read, please. The 3rd paragraph.
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
And Rabbi Elazar said, acts of kindness assisting someone in need are greater than charity, as it is stated. Sow to yourself, that's S-O-W, sow to yourself according to charity and reap according to kindness. Hosea 10:12. This means if a person sows, it is uncertain whether he will eat or whether he will not eat, since much can go wrong before the seed becomes food. However, if a person reaps, he can certainly eat. In this verse, charity is likening to sowing, while acts of kindness are likened to reaping.
Okay.
And Rabbi,
you understand that, yes?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. And it's you see, again, in an analogy, if you take that in terms of sowing seeds, right? You're talking about an agrarian society, primarily a farming society. So this type of a thing makes good sense, right? You have the food in hand, you can eat it. You plant, and the harvesting and the chance of a lost crop was an ongoing issue in Eretz Yisrael. You have a drought, right? Think about it. Where are you going to get water? Right? You're dependent on the rains. No rain, no drought. So this is a real issue for them. All right. Now, moving on. All right. So Kathy, continue. No, I'm sorry. Barbara was reading. Barbara.
No problem if Kathy wanted to read.
That's
No,
okay.
I'll get to her. I'll do one more and she'll read.
And Rabbi Elazar said, the reward for charity is paid from heaven, only in accordance with the kindness and generosity there included therein, and in accordance with the effort and the consideration that went into the giving. It is not merely in accordance with the sum of money, as it is stated, sow to yourself according to charity and reap according to kindness.
Right. Very interesting. So God knows, right? It says God is he knows what goes on inside of you. Right? He knows what's going on.
This kind of makes me think of the amount of charity that I do by seeing patients for free.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And in addition to seeing low-income patients as well at a lowered price.
Right. No, I understand. Well, that's the whole notion, that you're doing it with the understanding that this is an act of love on your part.
Yeah.
Are feeling that, and just being there for the person receiving it in one way or another, and the sense that this is a mitzvah that you're doing to help someone in need, and not just throwing money at them.
Right.
And that's the idea. Okay. All right. Okay, we can skip the next paragraph. Okay. All right. So, Kathy, now this notion of imitating God. Now, but just as a brief introduction, imitating God is something that is quite universal in many religions. The notion of taking how the God or gods act and carry them into your own life, in a positive way, shall we say, is not limited to Judaism, but clearly in the context of our tradition, this becomes a very important thing. Because we say if human beings are in the image of God, then what God does has an impact on us, should have an impact on us. Okay, and so that's what this is talking about. Okay, all right. So Kathy, Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says.
Rabbi Hama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what is the meaning of that which is written? After the Lord your God shall you walk, and him shall you fear, and his commandments shall you keep, and unto his voice shall you hearken, and him shall you serve, and unto him shall you flee. In Deuteronomy 13:5. But is it actually possible for a person to follow the divine presence? But hasn't it already been stated, for the Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God, in Deuteronomy 4:24. And one cannot approach fire, he explains. Rather, the meaning is that one should follow the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be he.
Continue.
He provides several examples. Just as he clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them, in Genesis 3:21, so too should you clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, visits the sick, as it was written with regard to God's appearing to Abraham following his circumcision, and the Lord appeared unto him by the terebinths of Mamre, Genesis 18:1. And so too should you visit the sick. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac, his son. Genesis 25:11. So too should you console mourners. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, buried the dead, as it is written, and he buried in the valley of land of Moab. Deuteronomy 34:6. so too should you bury the dead.
Right. Okay, so this is a classic, again, that comes from the prayer book. The prayer book incorporated it into the warm-up for the services, the early part of the morning services for Shabbat and holidays. But here it's clear, right? So that's what it means. So God does these things. These are divine actions, divine attributes. And in a sense, this it is a precursor for what Maimonides later on in the 12th century would say about how we can understand God. Because Rambam wrote that we can't know God, but we can see how God operates in the world. Okay, remember, he was a doctor, a scientist, a cultured man, he was a philosopher, right? He was a real Renaissance man. And so he could understand if you're sensitive to the world around you. I can't tell you what God is, but I can tell you what I see about God. And from that, we can get an inkling as to what God is about. Okay. And that is another way of expressing philosophically. And I'm not going to all the philosophy. It's not that simple in there. But the point is, it's the point that you look around and you see things that are part of the world. And you can even see it in human beings who act in a manner that becomes their being in the image of God. In other words, if you see a human being who does these things, Rambam would say, then you are seeing that this is because this is an individual who's created in the image of God. There is an element of the divine that is present that's mobilizing this person to do that.
But he preceded the Renaissance by several centuries.
Yes, of course. Yes, right. No, exactly. But, and Rambam was a believer, of course, but his concept of God was completely different from anybody else's. I'm not going to go into it. That's very technical right now. Okay. Anyway, so that's powerful stuff, right? And that's the whole point here is we are actually living a sacred life by doing these things because we are taking the actions that we associate with God and making them our own. And what could be a more profound statement? But the point is, you see, this goes back to where we started early on. What this is assuming is that you're going to make the association between the action and a divine action. And the whole idea is if you do this and you get a glimpse of what God is, then it gives you a jumping point to create a deeper spiritual link to God. With him, you've got to understand this is Rambam speaking. For him, spirituality is intellectual. He's not a mystic. So the unique thing that we have is intellect that defines us as a creature. It's the greatest gift of God. Okay? And our worshiping and all this stuff ultimately is to focus us on that moment when we can use our intellect and begin to get a spark of what God might be. And he's very, very clear on that, a spark. But it's using that. He's a philosopher. He's not a mystic. That's why the mystics didn't like him, and that's why he didn't like mysticism. Okay. And remember I said 16 different kinds of theologies. This is 2 of them. All right. Bert.
I'm looking at the Sim Shalom from 1985, and the placement of these sections actually replaces what in the Orthodox prayer book is a study of all the sacrifices.
Exactly.
The conservative movement, in fact, basically said, instead of studying the sacrifices, we're going to study these sections. And the sections they pulled out are sections about loving kindness.
Right.
I don't know if this predates 1985 because I don't have an earlier prayer book, but
no, okay.
It's kind of revolutionary because it basically is cutting at a very major part of what was the traditional service and replacing it with loving kindness.
Correct. But this is not the essence of the service. This is one.
No, it's at the beginning, but
But
nevertheless.
you're right. You're right. Well, look, let me just say the Silverman prayer book going back to the 1930s, the black one we used to use with the English translation that we couldn't understand, that talked already about the prayers being in the past tense. Okay, there were references to the temple, but the giving of sacrifices was done. It's not what we look forward to doing. Okay, and that was part of that process. And basically, rebuilding the temple today is not a priority issue with those of us who are conservative Jews.
But we still do Musaf.
Yeah, we do it as nothing wrong in remembering the fact that reminds you that the prayer is in lieu of the sacrifice, and it's a good thing. I don't believe we should forget that we came from a sacrificial foundation. We shouldn't. And so there are some people today who say that we should remind us of these things and we should pray for the restoration of sacrifices, only meaning that we should view the things that we do as being the equivalent in sanctity as the ancients did when they brought sacrifices. Okay, it's a concretization of the concept of sanctity. Okay, I personally, that doesn't resonate with me, but I agree that the references in the past tense remind us that in the olden days we did that, and that was a foundation on which we were built. Today we do it in a different way, and God bless today. It's much more meaningful to me, and I have no desire to bring a goat to the temple. I wouldn't even know what to do with it. Bobby.
I wonder if there are conservative synagogues that substitute something regarding social action for the Avodah service on Yom Kippur, for example. It might be a great opportunity to talk about social act, because it certainly is the part of the service that resonates the least with me.
Yeah.
But you would think that maybe some conservative synagogues would alter that whole part of the service.
I wouldn't. I think that's a very good point. What I would
make it a social action kind of thing.
Right. I agree.
Acts of loving kindness or projects for within the community to reach out to the sick and the
yes. That's a very good concept.
Moving.
And I think that you can even start off by referencing that, and even having one of the elements there where the high priest does his thing, and then you say, we no longer have the temple. The high priest is not going to come and sprinkle the blood and neutralize and cleanse us from our sins. That's not going to happen. But what we can do to reorient our values is to deeply immerse ourselves in acts of loving kindness. And that can reinforce us, and that can cleanse us if we see the significance of doing these things. That will purify us morally and accomplish the same thing that the sprinkling of the blood did in ancient times.
Does anybody know of any congregations that have done that?
I don't know. I don't. I am no longer a pulpit rabbi.
But you may have had colleagues. You may have had colleagues who've discussed things like that.
No, I never had that discussion. No. All right. Then finally, yes. Yeah. Well, we talked about this Hosea thing, Yochanan ben Zakkai. Oh, that's a nice one. I like it anyway. This is from Avot de Rabbi Natan, all right, at the top of page 3 of your notes. I'll read it quickly. Once as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was coming forth from Jerusalem, Rabbi Joshua followed him and beheld the temple in ruins. Woe unto us, cried Rabbi Joshua. That is the place, the place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for, is laid waste. Okay, so how are we going to atone for our sins? My son, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, be not grieved. We have another atonement that is like it. And what is it? Acts of loving kindness, chesed, as it is said, for I desire loving kindness and not sacrifice. Okay, And there's a note there explaining how the rabbinic interpretation actually modified somewhat the meaning of the original text. But the point is, that's a classic. That's a classic. Okay. And that is a, if you wanted to find a hook upon which, Bobby, to do what you just said, there it is. There it is, right? All right, the last two things, and then we'll stop. All right, we can just read. I just want to read these because I think they're just they deal with some very wise statements, okay? And this whole notion of responding to destruction with love, where was God, and so forth. So somebody please read Held, page 284, Kindle.
I often come back to an argument made by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik about what he sees as Judaism's approach to the problem of evil. The ideal Jewish response to evil and suffering, he says, is not metaphysical but practical. We do not inquire about the hidden ways of the Almighty, Rav Soloveitchik writes, but rather about the path wherein a person shall walk when suffering strikes. We ask neither about the cause of evil nor about its purpose, but rather about how long it might be mended and elevated. How shall a person act in a time of trouble? What ought a person to do so that they not perish in their afflictions?
Okay. So I can tell you I resonated with this because, people, when you deal with people who've lost a loved one, especially tragic things, and I always say, they say, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to the deceased? And I always say, you're asking the wrong question. It's not why, but how. How can I address this in a way that I can find comfort? How can I address this in a way that I can substitute the evil that I saw, the chaos that I experienced, with something that is positive, that can provide comfort for someone, it can provide comfort for me, that can restore my hope. Those are the things we have to do. What can you do as a mourner in tragedy that helps you step out of that and understand that there's truth in what Soloveitchik says. He's a great mind, Rav. That's the Rav. Great mind. And he's right. You cannot understand why these things happen. Okay? I said one thing. I just want to remind you of something. Part of the problem here is there is one element of experience that can help us understand this kind of evil. And I will pose a question to you. From the 3rd chapter of Genesis to the end of the Bible, the final verse of Divrei Hayamim, of Chronicles, what is the single most powerful force for chaos in the world?
Human emotions.
I would say the human being. Us. Now, the Christians interpreted that as original sin, right? It's a sign of what we inherited. I don't accept the concept of original sin because I think everybody has to be held responsible for their own sin, not for what somebody who lived before us did. But on the other hand, I will say that I do believe what the rabbis tried to understand as how we are made up. We've talked about this concept of the Yetzer Hara, the inclination toward evil, which the rabbis themselves admit is powerful. And that's part of the Anochiyut that we started with, the ego. That's wrapped up in our sense of self-preservation. right? It's natural. You want to preserve yourself, and that you do things when you think you're threatened. If you have the power, you'll do something to stop the threat. But when does it stop? And, and the rabbis tell us, therefore, Torah, that is to say, spiritual and ethical guides to living and an understanding of our responsibility to others, those are the kinds of things that can control the Yetzer Hara, the inclination toward evil. And that's why you have to do them. So we've struggled, our sages have struggled with this question for millennia. And the bottom line is, more often than not, it ends up on our desks as human beings. And I honestly believe, I told you the story already, my high holiday sermon where the amount of money spent on war as opposed to the amount of money spent on medicine. Remember that? That was the theme. I mentioned that in a high holiday sermon. Okay, it had nothing to do with, some people viewed it as political. It wasn't. It was just a general statement about how the world operates. So this was a number of years ago when I was still senior rabbi. So I think I told you, we had these horrible deaths, one right after another, and the congregation was in a state of depression. Not everybody, but elements were, and it had to be dealt with. So I threw it out there. And this was my Rosh Hashanah sermon, first day Rosh Hashanah. And I said, okay, how much money is spent? And they were all, by the way, the questions were asked. Why? Rabbi, why was this happening? And I said, okay, I checked on something. How much money has been allocated in the United States this past year on defense? $700 billion. This was in 2005, 6, I don't remember. How much money between government money and private money was spent on medical research? $120 billion. 700 billion versus 120 billion. And I said, I asked two prominent physicians, members of our synagogue, if the numbers were reversed and if humankind spent $700 billion on medicine and $120 billion on defense, would we be far ahead of where we are now in dealing with disease? And they both looked at me and said, are you crazy? That's a stupid question. Of course we would. So there, my friends, is the answer. God did not mandate this. This is a choice human beings have made because of the reality of how our world is operating. That's the big problem. And that's why I say, from chapter 3 of Genesis to the end of Chronicles, the human being, not God, is responsible for a lot of our swords. And on that happy note, let us turn the page. See, I know how to call page turning. That I didn't forget from being a pulpit rabbi. Last thing, let me read it. I say, this is his conclusion at the end of chapter 12, Waiting for God. In a world suffused with suffering, we are called to clothe the naked and visit the sick, to comfort the mourners and bury the dead. In a world plagued by indifference, we are commanded to care about and for our neighbors. In a world overrun by cruelty, we are challenged to embody kindness, even and especially toward the world, those whom the world ignores and demeans. In a world preoccupied with wealth and possessions, we are bidden to lead lives of open-hearted generosity. In a world drowning in hatred and hostility, we are summoned to stand for love.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.